excited to be here today. Really grateful that on this Memorial Day that we can all come together as a virtual community from such disparate places across the United States to really think about the legacies and the diversity of experiences that bring us here today, 101 years after the passage of the 1924 Immigration Act. So to frame our event and to get us started, I would love to introduce the founder and creative director of UPRISERS, Michelle Hanabusa. Michelle, welcome to the stage.
Thank you so much, Hollis. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for taking your morning and afternoon to be with us here today. I know it is a holiday, so I do want to acknowledge today as Memorial Day. The image that you will see here, next slide, is an iconic photo of the 442nd Regiment, a unit made up of Japanese American soldiers during World War II, and they fought very bravely for a country that had incarcerated their families. We wanted to take this moment to not only honor them, but also all veterans who have served and sacrificed for our freedom, especially at a time when our histories and in the institutions that preserve them are under threat. Today, May 26th, also marks 101 years since the Immigration Act of 1924, a law that banned immigration from Asia and restricted it from most of the world. It wasn't just about immigration, it was about exclusion, racism, and defining who was allowed to be American. And over a century later, we're still feeling its effects. Here at Uprisers, we believe in learning from history to build a better future. And through our project, We Are 1924, we've been creating a space for such conversations around global migration, identity, and the power of collective memory. Today's event is part of that effort, and we're so honored to be joined by historians, community leaders, and subject matter experts to help us better understand the roots and impact of 1924 and what it means for us today. Whether you're hearing about this history for the first time or have long been part of the fight for justice and representation, We Are 1924 is a space for us to hear our full stories and to imagine a more inclusive path forward, because our history and our stories are American history. Thank you again for being in community with us today, and I'll pass it back to Hollis.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for those beautiful words and that beautiful opening. And what a tremendous gift to be able to gather to learn from the historians and the community leaders that are joining us today in this program. First, we're going to get started with exploring more about the We Are 1924 project that Uprisers launched last year for the centennial anniversary of the 1924 Immigration Act, and going to learn about what we're doing today to infuse creativity and community building across the United States to better galvanize as a community towards strengthening as our understanding of our immigrant heritage and futures. Then we're going to take a group photo. And so we're going to ask people to go on camera and pose with us. And hopefully you're rocking your 1924 gear. And if not, we'd just love to see your beautiful faces. We're going to move into the history of 1924 itself. And we're really excited to be joined by Mike Murakase my apologies. That section is going to be shared by Mariko Lockridge, who has been a stalwart collaborator on the We Are 1924 project. If you are somebody who's participated in the portraits, you have likely spoken with her for the storytelling portion. So we're really excited to speak with her and to learn from her and all that she's prepared. It'll be amazing. Then we'll move on to Mike Murase. And Mike Murase is an incredible organizer that in the Little Tokyo area, and we'll be learning more about how the history of 1924 shows up today in our lives and what that means for our communities. And then finally, we're really excited to have Tao Ha join us and explain more about where we are today and historically what our call to action can be. So three incredible speakers. But first, I'm going to kick it over to Michelle to explain more about the We Are 1924 Creative Project and what we've been doing this year to celebrate, to learn, and to connect.
Thank you so much, Hollis. So, 1924 recently went on a tour over this past 2 months. But before all of that, it really started on February of last year when Mariko and Mike Marase, who's also our guest speakers today, got together at a local cafe. If you go to the next slide, um, where we met up at a local cafe, Suehiro Cafe, based in downtown Los Angeles, not only to just catch up, have our annual get together, but also to learn a little bit more about what's going on today. And so 1924 was really born out of knowledge that Mike shared with us on this date, and what are some creative ways and creative projects that we can ignite in order to kickstart this project. So we kicked off our first 100 stories of all backgrounds and generations for 100 years and have since been able to accomplish many, many exciting projects and cities along the way. Till this date, we were able to document over 51 portraits and stories. If you go to the next slide. Covering over 17 nations of origins, 7 states of residence, and multi generations from ages 5 all the way till 70 plus. We've also been able to kick off our portrait series in 4 different cities, starting here in Los Angeles, then over to New Orleans, Phoenix, St. Louis, and coming soon will be our next city, which is in Minneapolis. I wanted to give a special thank you to Hollis, who is not only our host today, but to really bring chapter 2 of We Are 1924 to life. She is the founder of Homework, which is a strategic storytelling and creative production studio who supported our efforts of this 1924 tour in finding talented local photographers and candidates to join our We Are 1924 project. Really excited to have her on today, and I'll pass it over to her to share a little bit more about her experience thus far and one of the cities that we were able to cover.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And yeah, big shout out to the origin story and to Mike, Mariko, and Michelle being in dialogue and in community with each other to give life to this project that's now expanded across the United States. I feel very grateful as a creative to be brought on as like a thought partner and collaborator. And I have to say, it's been a joy to have my company produce the portraiture sessions and bring together local communities starting in New Orleans, and then we've done Phoenix so far. We just did St. Louis in collaboration with OCA, and then we have Minneapolis and Nashville still to come. So we wanted to make sure when we identified these cities that we were going to cities that aren't traditionally spoken of when we think about immigrant legacies or cities that don't often get the creative shine that they should. And I will say that one of my favorite parts of this project has been getting to research and explore and dive deep on Instagram to find really dope creatives, really dope photographers to bring into the fold. So our next speaker that I'm excited to be in conversation with is one of those creatives whose work just leapt off the screen for me. And when we shared it internally at UPRISERS, we were really excited to invite her to be our photographer for New Orleans. So Kim Ha is a multifaceted creative and community advocate. She has 15 years of experience in photography, and her work has been exhibited in galleries and museums throughout New Orleans. She is a Vietnamese American, and I'm just excited to have her join and share a little bit more about what it was like to collaborate with us to bring her beautiful portraits to life. So, Kim, welcome to the stage.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kimberly Ha. I am a kind of a multifaceted creative down here in New Orleans. When I got the email from Hollis, I was so excited because I've been working on a personal project of my own. I am a Vietnamese American, was born in Houston, Texas, moved and raised in New Orleans. My mom and father are both Vietnamese immigrants who came to the South specifically to basically like make a life for themselves. And the story I'm telling right now was with me and my mom. She is a single mom that is in the nail industry, which is probably a very common story for a lot of us Vietnamese kids. So I'm telling her story through full set. And so when I got the email from Hollis about 1924, being able to tell these immigrant stories are very, very important because they're very um, the same in some instances and very different. And I was just super excited to meet different faces. Of course, around New Orleans, a lot of these faces were my friends. But I was very proud and honored to be a part of it. Yeah, yeah, the whole journey was great. Hollis was great. The whole team is great, and everyone loved the t-shirts, and they really love the mission behind the t-shirt as well. And I think one common thing I saw was people were so proud to like stand up and say like, "Hey, this is I'm representing my culture, my country, my parents," and yeah, that was probably my favorite part of everything.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it's amazing that like you've been using photography to really explore and celebrate um, your mother's experience and her story, and obviously like bringing that into your own and making that kind of an autobiographical expression through photography. If we could go to the next slide, we can actually see some of the portraits that Kim took for the We Are 1924 project here. And yeah, I'm curious. Kim, walk us through how the day went. Like maybe if you want to share a little bit about the portraits that we're looking at now, or did anything like surprise you or delight you while you were taking these portraits? And what was the process like?
So definitely the first two. Mo is the first one. He is a Palestinian content creator here in New Orleans. He's also a very big foodie who's very well known. And he's a massive following, like crazy big following, but like of course using his platform to talk about the Palestinians and what's going on in Gaza and everything right now. And that's something he was just like, "Oh, I've never gotten my pictures taken." And I was just like, "You're a content creator. You need to do this. You share such a massive story." And I think that's like the most beautiful thing about when I met Mo. He was just like, "Oh, thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this." He was just really grateful because if he can use any platform to share what's going on to the Palestinian people, what's happening in Gaza, he's going to utilize it. And I think this is such a great way for him to share that story even more. Vanessa is a really good friend of mine. I didn't know she was Thai until recently. And she came in with like a traditional skirt or like longer dress or skirt. And I was just like, "Would you mind doing the dance?" And she was like, "Oh, I only did it with my mom. I'm not that good." I was just like, "Oh, no worry." We put on like Thai music and like had her doing the dance. So she was really, really fun with that. And then she showed me charms. And I love about like the last three was everyone brought in a piece of prop, and the third one she brought in rings and golds that were from Palestine, and she was like, "Can I wear these? Can you really get the detail?" I'm like, "Yeah, of course, I got you, girl." Like she was like so proud to wear the jewelry from her culture. And then the last one, the mom and daughters, I was just like, "What's these props about?" And she learned that I learned that they use these to dance with. And then her mom even took off her shoes because she's like, "I want to be in my natural environment where we're usually barefoot." And I was like, "Yeah, do you? Whatever is comfortable." So just being able to like hear these stories and learn these stories and like also like just educate myself on the different cultures that are around New Orleans because we're such like a big gumbo pot of people. It was just a very magical and beautiful day.
I'm just curious, like, you obviously have already been utilizing your portraiture and your photography to storytell. And I'm curious if you could kind of maybe share just like any thoughts that you have about being a creative and what it means to use your creativity to convey stories, especially immigrant stories. Like, why is it so important? And like, why do you think it's so important to support?
I think using okay, as a kid, my mom and dad always were like, "Put your head down, be good," right? That's a very common story as well. Like, put your head down, be good, don't cause any trouble, don't try to be super expressive. They want me to be like work in a safe field. And when I quit Microsoft and got into creative field, I was like, I want to tell stories. I want to be in brand narrative. That's what I want to do. Telling really impactful stories like our stories got me to where I am now. So I think a lot of people sometimes like you can hear the story, but seeing it visually gives you that like impact, right? Being a part of the Ogden and was a part of the 50th Fall of Saigon like exhibition, like I got to be a part of that because of my storytelling that I wanted to tell about what my mom did when she left the country, right? And I think that's the most important thing. And supporting people who are telling these stories are very impactful because, you know, like growing, like back in the day, that's how people heard things. You told stories around the campfire. You just heard stories, right? And I've always been someone who's overactive in my imagination, so I wanted to like be creative and tell the stories of my mom in a very creative way, not just like, oh, she worked in a nail salon, she left the country, she made a life for us, but like her bringing me to the nail salon and just like being like meeting different types of walks of life and just being able to like say, hey, like I can take these moments in the nail salon with her and tell the stories for her. And everyone, when you look at full set, that's what you see. Like there's moments of me in the kitchen with my mom and we watch old kung fu like soap operas, right? So recreating moments like that in my work was what made full set to be so successful. And I think,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think that's
Sorry.
what people want, like, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking about that, I really feel like oftentimes we hear about like content creation, content creation, content creation. It can just feel like almost kind of like clinical or like we're just kind of like on the capitalist hamster wheel. But what I'm hearing from you and what I'm reminded by when I look at these portraits and think about We Are 1924 as a project, it's cultural creation. Like we are catalyzing culture through creative work and storytelling, like the work that Mariko is stewarding. And that's what we're doing. We're culture creators. So thank you, Kim, so much for joining us. We so appreciate you. Thank you for being down. We're really excited to dive into this history and bringing it into the present. So I'm excited to bring on to stage Mariko Lockridge. If we'll get the slide deck back up. And Mariko, as Michelle mentioned, is really like a founding creative and member of this project. And we're excited to hear more about the historical context about what's bringing us to the We Are 1924 project today.
Thank you guys so much for having me on. And hopefully the slides will pop back up in a second. As Michelle mentioned earlier and Hollis mentioned my introduction, my name is Mariko Lockridge and I'm the lead researcher for the We Are 1924 project. In fact, when you visit the We Are UPRISERS website, next slide please, you can see our summary of the Immigration Act of next slide, sorry. You can see the summary of the Immigration Act of 1924 where it reads, in 1924, the U.S. banned immigration from Asia and created limited numbers of immigrants permitted from other countries. By setting quotas based on the 1890 census, the act strategically and legally prioritized immigrants from northern and western nations. These national origin quotas would continue until 1964. Even though this is a mouthful, there is so much packed into this act that the effort to distill it down to one or two sentences did take us several months of research and consulting with subject matter experts. And to be very honest, especially as a former news journalist, it did keep me up at night that we were oversimplifying a very impactful and complex piece of legislation. On the next slide, you'll see a picture of me. And even though I began working on this project in 2024, it wasn't until earlier this year in 2025, when I visited Argentina, I had my aha moment. This is literally my friend Luli capturing me in my aha moment where I'm standing in an immigration museum in Puerto Madero in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Argentina is another country with a very troubling history, especially around immigration and people of color. And that's me on the right, staring at those yellow lines on a window pane filled with historical facts related to Argentinian history. If you go to the next slide, you'll be able to see what I was looking at there. And I have a PDF of this, which I'll share with all of you afterwards. So it's a little bit fading out. Oh, there we go. So on this slide, you'll see 3 rows and lots of tiny text from top to bottom that represent a timeline of world history, Argentinian history, and Argentinian immigration history starting from the 1800s up until continued present day. And when I saw this in this museum in another country, I felt kind of like Neo that was seeing the Matrix for the first time. It was so clear to see how and why what was happening around the world could lead to the Immigration Act of 1924 in the United States when I saw it in this way. And as I was staring at this timeline, on the next slide, you'll see a photo of one section of that timeline in the museum, where on the bottom row, you can see that in 1924, Argentina was also beginning to create legislative limitations to immigrants entering their country. And like the United States, this was happening because of what was happening in Europe, World War, famine, religious persecution, and these were different factors that were impacting human immigration or flight. My current project that I'm hoping to share with you guys right now on the next slide is I've taken that same timeline that I saw in Argentina, and I'm currently adapting it to our history, where I am looking at world history, U.S. history, and U.S. immigration history, and laying it out as well. And so when I started looking at this and seeing this timeline in the context of world history, I was able to start to see certain themes that would be factors influencing human migration that could be an advantage to a nation state. So on the next two slides, you'll see these two slides I created that starkly show different geopolitical factors that would create a need for human bodies or beings to be the focus of a political strategy. In fact, on the next slide, when we're still looking at these same geopolitical factors, we're now thinking them in terms of human migration and what causes displacement versus what will bring them an invitation to cross the boundaries or borders. It's a little push and pull of human beings on a global chessboard. So let's go back to when UPRISERS first asked me to dive into this very dense topic, the Immigration Act of 1924. I did what any good bookworm would do, and I went to the public library, and I shout out to librarians. The Central Library in downtown Los Angeles was such an amazing resource for me, as well as several used bookstores across the country that I stepped into to create our resource library. I took all this information, and I have created a bullet point of what is the Immigration Act of 1924, distilled down to a couple different major things that we can see today. And so on the next slide, you'll see that the major things that were established in 1924 through the Immigration Act included the national origins quota system, which started by limiting based on the Census Act of the 1890s, which would be highly favoring Northern and Western European immigrants. This was actually later changed to just overall limit like how many immigrants could come into the country. And then the restriction from Southern and Eastern Europe, because the one thing to understand at that time, what they saw as a good white American would be not only to be Anglo-white Saxon, but also to be a Protestant Anglo-white Saxon. And at that time, Southern and Eastern Europe were considered to be outliers of this kind of ideal American, future American into the United States. This quota system limited immigration also from Italy, Poland, and Greece, who had also received waves of immigration. And it also completely excluded immigrants from Asia, including Japan and China. And it created the U.S. Border Patrol. So if you ever want to know where that came from, 1924 is your answer. And finally established a consular control system, which started the system of visas from U.S. consulates abroad before being allowed to enter the country. And so a lot of these things that we see today continue to be a part of what we are impacted by. Before I conclude my section of today's discussion around the Immigration Act of 1924, I just want to briefly mention the Immigration Act of 1965. So leading up to 1965, JFK was very passionate about undoing a lot of the damage that had been done in the 1920s to the United States. And although he was assassinated before he was able to pass his contribution, Lyndon B. Johnson was able to make sure that did become part of JFK's legacy. The most significant part of the 1965 Immigration Act was to undo that quota system, which had its roots in eugenics and that focus on the Anglo-Saxon white Protestants. In 1965, immigration policy refocused its priorities on family reunification and skills, and this has led to a greater diversity in the U.S. population ever since. However, in my opinion, a lot of the damage has already been done. This belief in a preferred kind of America and the propaganda that was created from the confidence gained in the legitimization of the Immigration Act of 1924, it's already settled into the mindset of many Americans over generations. And this impact has and will continue to take time and healing to undo, which is why I'm really proud to be a part of a project like We Are 1924. I only had 10 minutes to run through about 100 years of history, but I'm really grateful for this time with all of you and super, super happy for the next speaker, Tao, who's going to talk about where we're at today and how our history has impacted our present. Thank you guys so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Mariko. I am so impressed by your scholarship, and it's clear that you bring such a literacy, but also such a passion to this topic. And I have to say, like learning about 1924, the Immigration Act of 1924, and the seeds that it planted that we're seeing grow in a terrible way today, whether it's U.S. border control or exactly what you were just speaking to, the entrenched conditioning of who is and who is not American in our culture and in our minds. It's so important to know in order to think about how can we identify it, what's embedded and conditioned within ourselves, how can we challenge that, and then how can we build community to resist that and create a far more inclusive, far more equitable reality today and tomorrow. So thank you so much, Mariko, for your scholarship. Now I'm really excited to turn to, again, what I will shorthand say is the godfather of the We Are 1924 project, UPRISERS, and is a veteran organizer and leader within the community here in Los Angeles. Mike Morase is joining us now to speak more about his work and his connection to this project. So welcome, Mike. Thank you so much for joining us. So really quickly, I'm just going to gas you up before I let you take the stage. You are a political activist and community organizer. You co-founded the UCLA Asian American Studies Center and the Little Tokyo Service Center. You are a member of Nikkei Progressives, and you were the very first portrait, Portrait Zero, captured for the We Are 1924 project. How are you doing today?
Good. I'm excited.
Excellent. So yeah, let's go over to the next slide. And Mike, I'm wondering if you could just walk us through both what's shared here in terms of your immigration story and what you were able to share with the We Are 1924 project. And let's start there. And then I'd love to hear more about what your experience was like.
All right. Thank you very much for allowing me into this space as a old Sansei baby boomer. Technologically challenged, but I'm happy to be in this space. When Michelle and Mariko and I casually started this conversation 15 months ago, I didn't think that it would have the impact and the relevance that it has now since the Trump administration has started implementing in very brutal and inhumane ways this, effort to deport something like 12 million people. Also, I think that I never anticipated that Michelle and Mariko would be developing the resistance and the educational program that has been launched and carried out for this past year. But so I'm very happy to see this and be a small part of this program. But I guess for me, the importance of the 1924 Act was not just in isolation, but growing up as an immigrant in this country and not ever learning about the history of our of Asian people, of other people of color. It really kind of hit home for me when I went to UCLA, started ethnic studies, and started learning, about our history. And so it really challenged me to kind of learn about my own family as well. And I mentioned just that I am an immigrant, but my family history goes back to the 1900s, where when my grandfather immigrated to this country. Um, at the age of 17, he found a job on a U.S. cargo ship and as a laborer and went back and forth from Japan to the U.S. And in one of the trips, when the ship docked in Seattle, he was chosen by the American captain to uh, accompany him ashore to buy and bring back provisions for the ship. But as soon as his feet touched the ground, my grandfather told me many years ago, he ran as fast as he could and he ran all night. And, because he wanted to explore America. But that type of incident was not uncommon in those days. And in fact, there's a term for it. They were called ship jumpers. Uh, People call them illegal aliens. But um, I think what the lesson that I have about the whole immigration uh, policy, law, and practice over the whole course of the entire course of the history of the United States is that many times when things like uh, Trump's policies come up, many people argue that you know illegal aliens should be deported. But for me, the question and the framework is not whether something is legal or illegal, but what is just or unjust. At one time, slavery was legal. Uh, at one time, the prohibition of women being able to vote was legal. And so I really think that it's important for us to keep in mind what's going on today in terms of um, immigration issues, but other issues as well. What what is it that makes us human? What is it that makes us think about not just ourselves, our families, or even our communities and our people, but as as human beings, how should we be really treating people? And I think the history that Mariko laid out briefly really tells us that it is not just a matter of one year or one set of laws, but it's been going on for many, many years, and I hope over the next several months we'll be able to explore some of those in more detail. But for now, I will stop right there and just you know. I'll take any questions later, but thank you very much for this opportunity to share my story.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you so much for sharing your personal story and also sharing that personal insight that I feel is really provocative towards, um, being critical thinkers and being in community and in movement, ideally with each other, recognizing that laws are reflections of society and culture. And it's really on us as a community to recognize that not all law should be followed by the letter, but rather be challenged and questioned and pushed towards a more inclusive and more equitable reality. And yeah, just really moved by your personal story and really appreciate you being, again, Portrait Zero and the very first story told by this We Are 1924 project, and for all you do in community as a leader to inspire the next generation. So thank you so much, Mike. All right, we are going to move on to our final speaker of the day, our final featured speaker. And this section is called In the Context of. And what we're going to be doing here is hearing from Thao Ha, who is a sociology professor at Miracosta. She is a Vietnamese refugee herself, and she's an advisor and associate producer of Sea Drift, a 2019 documentary about the racial violence and KKK intimidation in the 1970s against Vietnamese Americans in a small Texas fishing town. Thao, we're so excited to have you today, and welcome to the stage.
Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate you all. I apologize if this is going to be a little clunky. I just joined and learned about this group a couple weeks ago. And in addition to being a college professor, I also have a nonprofit that supports Southeast Asian brothers and sisters who are impacted by the justice system. And so the work is very intertwined in terms of like academic and kind of knowledge, and then organizing and seeking justice and protection and safety for our impacted communities. I was born in Vietnam in 1973. I came to the US in 1975 on April 30th, the fall of Saigon, with my parents at the time. We came to eventually be sponsored by a family in San Antonio, Texas, moved around the country about 4 times. Tennessee, Iowa, and then back to Texas, and settled in Houston as well. I am not related to Kim Ha, but we both grew up in Houston, and I grew up there until I left in the early 2000s for work and came to Oceanside, California in 2007 to begin my professor job at Maricosta College. And over the years, kind of working with the impacted community and reentry, helping support folks that come home from prison. You can't do that work without knowing how the immigration policies affect those individuals' lives. And so the first policy I want to talk about is the 1996 Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996. This is a huge reason why we are in the light that we are in now, with how it adjusted the Immigration and Nationality Acts of 1924, 1952, 1965, and 1990. And in addition, as Mike had said before, Trump's administration's Part 1 and Part 2 have also kind of ensnared what we know as our undocumented population. And early in these conversations of mass deportation, there was a lot of rhetoric around the going after the Latinos, going after the Mexicans, and kind of a lack of awareness in terms of how many Asian American and Pacific Islanders really account for that as well. And so according to the data on the Center of Policy for Migration Studies, there are approximately 1.7 million undocumented Asian American and Pacific Islanders. So that accounts for about 17% of undocumented folks in the US. And that's such a significant amount, with large populations from China and India as being almost 50% of that 1.7. And then other countries that are notable are South Korea, Vietnam. And so those are kind of those not talked about, not really understood, kind of not realizing that we have millions, of undocumented AAPI community members living among us in our communities. There are several 100,000 dreamers, and that are DACA individuals that are under threat as well. And in addition to those, there are the ones impacted by the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, which states that any non-citizen who is convicted of a crime is now deportable. And they have removal orders, meaning they have a notification by ICE and Department of Homeland Security to be forcibly removed from the United States. The cruelty of that Immigration Act of 1996 is that it is designating an aggravated felony as the conviction that makes one deportable. Not only is it applying to convictions after 1996, but it made it retroactive. So folks who have convictions from the 1970s, 80s, before 1996 were then placed into a status of removable. The convictions were also broad, did not have to be a violent conviction. It could be a state conviction, it could be a federal conviction, and all that is required is that that person spent 365 days incarcerated. So if you were convicted of fraud and were convicted to 1 year, you were now deportable, whether you committed it before 1996 or after 1996. So in those numbers, there are hundreds of thousands that are affected. The largest population are Chinese, from the Chinese community, with about 38,000 who have removal orders under the 1996 law. There are populations from Korea, Philippines, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam that have significant numbers as well. And in particular to the Southeast Asian community, it is clearly stemming from the war and the refugee conditions of being exiled after the Vietnam War. And so into the complexities of the policies of repatriation and immigration and war enemies versus now, economic partners with Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. We are seeing an accelerated number of our folks being deported after having lived here 50, 40, 30 years and had committed crimes decades ago and have rebuilt their lives because they weren't deportable at one point. And now with Trump changing all of those policies, we are seeing that mass increase. And so I know we are short on time. I'm going to end there, and I'm happy to answer any other questions after and also when we are off camera.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tao. Really appreciate you breaking down so comprehensively what the legacy is really today and how policies have shifted to really harm generations of folks, of American immigrants, of refugees. I was curious if you could join us just for one last question before we move to the general Q&A, Tao. Which you touched on the fact that the Trump administration has shifted these policies to then target and deport the families that you spoke of and the populations that you spoke of. And so my question is twofold. One, I'm curious, like, what actions are the government taking now specifically that we should be aware of that maybe like isn't as well known? And then secondly, like any call to action that you might have for us, like how can we as concerned and engaged residents of the United States, folks of immigrant descent, how can we be in solidarity with those who are being most targeted by these policies?
Sure. Thank you for that. Those two great questions. There are old agreements that the U.S. had with certain countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, that had protected these individuals with an understanding that they are refugees. And Trump, under his both administrations, 1 and 2, renegotiated those policies with respective countries. Laos being one of them, where there's no repatriation agreement, there's no process. And Trump had suspended the visas for coming to the U.S. With Cambodia and Laos and pretty much forced them to start taking back deportees. In Vietnam, there was a 2008 protection under George Bush that said we won't take back pre-95 Vietnamese. And 1995 is an important year because that's the year that the U.S. and Vietnam normalized political and economic relations. And so anyone who came before 95 was considered a refugee, and anybody who came after 95 was an immigrant. So there were thousands of pre-95 folks that were protected. And in November 2020, before Trump left office, he renegotiated that memorandum of understanding with Vietnam to start taking pre-95 folks. So those are kind of the tactics that he had used to really ensnare these folks. And so what the call to action, there are really awareness. There are a lot of folks who are not even aware because they had old understandings of how the system had worked before. There are pre-95 Vietnamese that thought, oh, I cannot be deported, but now they're being picked up by ICE. If you are aware of like the Know Your Rights workshops and Know Your Rights things with like ICE warrants versus court ordered warrants, there are ways that you can protect folks, but depending on the state, the region, the city, whether it is sanctuary or not, local law enforcement does cooperate or does not cooperate with ICE to get these individuals. One example that I'll share that you asked about, Hollis, is that these ICE warrants, there are approximately about 700,000 of them from the ICE database. They were never included in the national crime database that is used when, for example, you're driving, you get pulled over, the law enforcement officer looks looks for a warrant, and they were always criminal warrants before, but now ICE warrants are, those 700,000 have been dumped into the national crime database. So if you have a removal order and you're driving and you get pulled over, depending on the law enforcement agency, they will all be able to see that you have an ICE warrant and that you have a removal order. Depending on the agency, whether they cooperate or not, they could contact ICE and say, hey, we have somebody, and then ICE will come, has discretion to come and pick them up or not. We've seen that happening in Texas. We've seen that happening all across the South, in California on the West Coast. Huntington Beach, California has declared itself a non-sanctuary city, even though Orange County is sanctuary. San Diego County has declared itself sanctuary county, but the San Diego Sheriff's Office has declared itself not. And so if you get pulled over by San Diego Sheriff's, there's a likelihood that you will be picked up. We know of a case of a Vietnamese who moved from California to North Dakota, registered his car at the DMV. The DMV saw the removal order, called the local agency, held him at the DMV, and then called ICE, picked him up. ICE detained him, and then he was deported about 2 weeks ago. So those are the kind of actions that I think folks should be aware of when they say, be careful when you're driving, be careful when you're flying, be careful when you're just moving about, just living in place. There are undocumented and removal order people have to get worker IDs through the immigration system. They are now canceling all of those worker cards. So even trying to have employment is impossible if your employer requires a worker ID. And there are indications that immigration, USCIS will also have those removal orders and maybe working with ICE to detain those individuals if they come into the office to apply for worker cards. It's a vast coordinated process that Homeland Security and the Department of Justice are working. And you saw the news about the IRS and our tax information. It's pretty extensive, to which they will go to ensnare, detain, and deport folks.
Yeah, that's so infuriating. And the coordinated effort when there's so many social services that would strengthen us as Americans and as community. And the fact that this is the focus of uprooting and separating families and separating people from often, their places of work, their communities, their places of worship. It's just devastating. And the impact is felt and will be felt for generations. And I guess how my curiosity is like for those of us who are so pained by what's happening in this coordinated attack and this focus on targeting and removing immigrants today, do you have any calls to action for us? Like, what can we do as a community to resist and to protect our folks?
Yeah, this is, there were some strategies that we figured out during 1.0 that kind of was like, gather your community, talk to your elected officials, join the protests. And now those don't seem to be working. Our elected officials are just cowards in terms of like trying to protect our community, protect their constituents. And so you've got to go grassroots, right? So what we figured out is if you have local community organizations that are doing this work. And if I can, I'll share a link or a resource to you all so that Uprisers can share. There are community organizations across the U.S. that are really tracking, but also protecting and helping to support folks who are under removal orders or who are undocumented that are trying to legally get status as legal permanent residents. And they are ICE is showing up to courthouses, waiting for ICE prosecutors to dismiss their case and then arresting them outside the courthouse. So if you know anyone who has a court hearing, please ask them to have their attorney request a virtual hearing because they will show up the courthouse. They're doing it across the nation. We don't know, and those are for the asylum seekers, so those are undocumented folks. If you know any folks who have past criminal convictions, there's an extra layer of that you have to remind them to be prepared when they go into ICE check-ins. So ICE requires these folks to check in annually with them, and that's where they're detaining a lot of folks as well. So really, it's understanding your community, getting to know the local organizations that are doing this, and learning all the nuances of how Homeland Security is working. And really at this point, it's really knowledge based. So many people are unaware, and the more knowledge you have, the more ways that you'll seek more knowledge to find how to protect and support these folks. And I'm a realist. We are seeing deportations every 2 weeks to Southeast Asia. So at some point, it's about how do we support folks when they land. So we're trying to see how Laos and Cambodia are operating. Cambodia used to have an organization on the ground. Their funding was cut by US aid cuts. And so they are super slim in how they can support. In Vietnam, there's an art organization that is volunteer-based, and we did mutual aid fundraising. So we can give backpacks to the guys and knowledge about how to maneuver once they land in Vietnam. But that's all grassroots work.
Yeah, and to that point, thank you so much, Tao, for sharing. I mean, you clearly hold so much knowledge about not just what's happening and the targeting and the removal of American immigrants, but also just the grassroots and mutual aid efforts and how important it is for each of us to tap into our local communities and recognize that in order to protect ourselves, it really starts on the grassroots level. And that's incumbent on each of us to do that research, to think about how can I outreach to the folks that are really on the ground delivering service and providing for families that have been impacted, as well as the folks that are subject to being targeted by ICE. So thank you so much, Tao. I'm so appreciative. And thanks to all y'all for being part of our program. Just know that if you go to We Are Uprisers website, we have not only a page for We Are 1924 as a project, but also a link of resources. If you navigate to the page on We Are Uprisers to find out more, you can find the resources there. And we highly encourage y'all. We so appreciate you coming to this virtual convening. And we not only encourage y'all to share the information that you learned today with your community, but also to dive deeper and think about how you can be an agent of change.